It was supposed to be nothing more than a quick trip, the kind of errand so ordinary that no one even thinks twice about it. On a cool Sunday morning in early spring, 42-year-old Mark Ellison grabbed his car keys, kissed his wife on the cheek, and promised he'd be back in under an hour. He had done the same thing hundreds of times before. Bread, milk, some fruit for the kids' lunches. His wife remembered him saying he'd be home before they finished tidying up the kitchen. But those were the last words she ever heard from him. At first, there was nothing unusual about his absence. His wife assumed the lines at the grocery store were longer than usual, or that he had run into someone he knew and stopped to chat. Mark was known for that, friendly, talkative, never in a rush when it came to neighbors or acquaintances. An extra 15, 20 minutes didn't seem worth worrying about, but when an hour passed and then another, the feeling in the house shifted. By mid-afternoon, his wife began to check the clock with growing unease. The first calls she made were practical. She rang Mark's cell phone only to hear it go straight to voicemail. She checked with her sister to see if maybe he had stopped by, and even called a couple of his closest friends, but none of them had spoken to him. When dinner time neared and there was still no sign of him, she loaded the kids into the car and drove the same 2-mile stretch between their house and the grocery store, scanning for signs of a breakdown. But the road was clear, no stranded car on the shoulder, no flashing hazards, no trace of him at all. By evening, the fear became undeniable. His wife contacted the local police department, and an official missing person report was filed. Officers responded quickly, arriving at the Ellison home to gather information. They asked about his state of mind, his routine, whether he had been under stress. She insisted nothing was wrong. Mark was a stable, responsible man, deeply devoted to his family. The idea that he would just walk away on purpose seemed absurd to everyone who knew him. Detectives began with the most logical explanation: car trouble. They called in patrol units to check the route and the surrounding area, but no car was found. They contacted the local hospital, thinking perhaps he had been in an accident or admitted for a medical emergency, but there were no records of anyone matching his description. The strangeness of it all struck the officers almost immediately. In most cases, there's at least a trail, credit card activity, phone pings, a witness sighting. But for Mark, there was nothing. He had simply vanished somewhere between the store's automatic sliding doors and the front step of his home. Back at the Ellison house, panic gave way to a heavy silence. His children, too young to fully understand, kept asking where their father was, and each time his wife struggled to give an answer that felt believable. She kept glancing at the driveway, half expecting to see his car pull in, headlights sweeping across the front yard, but the driveway stayed empty. As night fell, officers returned to say they had no leads. They asked if she could provide recent photos, details about what he had been wearing, any particular habits. The reality was beginning to settle in. This was not a delay. This was something else entirely. The first 24 hours are always critical in a missing person case, and investigators knew it. They began canvassing the neighborhood, asking residents if they had seen anything unusual that day. Some recalled seeing his car pass in the morning, but no one remembered it coming back. It was as if the vehicle had disappeared off the road entirely. Others claimed they hadn't noticed anything at all. There were no witnesses to an accident, no one who saw him pulled over, no signs of distress. By midnight, the search widened. Police units combed through side roads, parking lots, and wooded areas that bordered the town. Nothing. Officers brought in a helicopter with a thermal camera to scan the fields, but the flight turned up no sign of his car or body heat signatures on the ground. The trail was cold from the very beginning. Inside the Ellison home, fear turned into dread. His wife sat awake through the night, clutching her phone, waiting for it to ring. Every creak of the house made her look up. She replayed every detail of that morning in her mind, asking herself if there had been any hint, any clue that something was wrong. There was nothing. Just a man going out for groceries who never came back. By dawn, investigators had to admit it. They were facing a disappearance that made no immediate sense, and though the case had just begun, there was already a sense among them that this was not going to be an ordinary missing person report. It was something stranger, something darker. Mark Ellison hadn't just vanished. He had been swallowed by a silence that no one could yet explain. Investigators began with the only certainty they had. the grocery store. It was the last known place where Mark Ellison had been seen alive. Detectives pulled the store's surveillance footage from that morning, and what they saw was painfully ordinary. There he was, walking through the aisles with his list in hand, selecting bread, fruit, milk, and a pack of cereal his kids loved. He waited in line, spoke casually with the cashier, swiped his card, bagged the groceries, and pushed the cart out the front doors. Nothing about his demeanor suggested stress or fear. There were no mysterious figures trailing him, no sign of confrontation. At 11:06 a.m., the cameras showed him loading the bags into the trunk of his sedan, shutting it, and sliding into the driver's seat. At 11:09, he pulled out of the lot and turned right toward home. That was it, the last concrete moment anyone could place him. From there, investigators retraced the route, a 2-mile stretch of suburban road lined with modest homes, patches of woods, and open fields. It was a road he had driven thousands of times. Officers canvassed each property along the way, knocking on doors, asking neighbors what they had seen. Several remembered spotting his dark blue sedan that morning, driving past at a normal speed. But here was the detail that unsettled detectives. While multiple people recalled seeing him headed away from the store, no one remembered him driving back. Somewhere on that short stretch, his car had vanished. Patrol units ran the route repeatedly, searching for any sign of skid marks, broken guardrails, or disturbed brush that might suggest his vehicle left the roadway. There was nothing. No tracks, no broken branches, no glass on the asphalt. It was as if the car had been erased from the landscape. The area wasn't heavily trafficked, but it wasn't deserted either. On a Sunday morning, there were dog walkers, joggers, people mowing lawns. Detectives struggled with the idea that an entire vehicle could disappear in broad daylight without a single witness. They widened the search beyond the road, combing nearby parking lots and service roads. They checked construction sites, ponds, and gravel turnouts where someone might have pulled off. Still, nothing. The unsettling truth was dawning. The last frame of him leaving the grocery store was the last anyone could find. What happened in those minutes between checkout and home was a complete void. Detectives revisited the footage again and again, slowing it down, scanning the background. They looked for unusual vehicles leaving the lot after him, anyone lingering by the exits, anything out of place. But the feed yielded no shadowy figures, no pursuit. He was alone. When his car merged into traffic, it became just another vehicle disappearing into the flow until it never re-emerged on the other end. As night fell, investigators set up checkpoints along the road, stopping drivers, asking if anyone had seen a stalled sedan or a man walking. They brought in cadaver dogs to follow any scent along the shoulders, but the dogs failed to pick up a strong trail. The silence of the road began to feel oppressive. Detectives admitted to one another that in most missing person cases, even the strangest ones, there are fragments, receipts, a phone ping, a witness. With Mark, there was a clean break, as though his life had been sliced in two, before the grocery store and after, with nothing in between. Neighbors grew uneasy. Rumors spread that perhaps he had been forced off the road, abducted, or carjacked. Some whispered about hidden roads or sinkholes, recalling stories of unstable ground near the wooded ravine, but those were half-formed theories, with no proof to anchor them. For his family, the uncertainty was unbearable. His wife replayed the footage of him shopping, her hand shaking as she pointed out how ordinary he looked. She said it felt like watching a ghost, knowing those were the last minutes she'd ever see of him moving, breathing, alive. Detectives doubled down, bringing in drones to scan the forest edges and nearby creeks. The aerial searches turned up only tree canopies and empty stretches of road. No crushed metal glinting in the sunlight, no patch of earth disturbed. Each day ended with frustration, each night with his family staring at the driveway, waiting for headlights that never came. By the end of the week, investigators admitted the chilling truth to his wife. Mark's trail ended the moment he drove out of the grocery store parking lot. Everything after was speculation. To the public, the case was described as open and active, but behind closed doors, detectives whispered that it made no sense. Cars don't just vanish, not on a short suburban road in broad daylight. And yet, in Mark Ellison's case, that's exactly what seemed to have happened. The vanishing point wasn't just a stretch of asphalt. It was a wall of silence that no one could yet penetrate, a mystery that would only deepen as the days dragged on without him. By evening, a break finally came, though it only deepened the mystery. A patrol unit, expanding the search grid, spotted a dark blue sedan parked just off a narrow gravel pull-off near the edge of a wooded lot. The plates confirmed it. It was Mark Ellison's car. Relief briefly surged through investigators. For the family, the discovery meant at least they were no longer searching blind. But when officers approached the vehicle, the relief quickly turned into unease. The sedan was locked, sitting neatly as if it had been parked with care. There was no crash damage, no broken glass, no sign of panic or flight. Through the windows, officers could see the grocery bags in the back seat still intact, the bread, the fruit, the milk, exactly as he had purchased them earlier that morning. It looked like he had driven here, stopped, and simply walked away. But where? And why? The car was towed to a secure lot for processing. Forensic teams went over every inch of it. They dusted for prints, scanned for hair, fibers, or blood. Nothing appeared out of place. The only fingerprints belonged to Mark. The driver's seat was adjusted to his height. His wallet and phone were not inside, but the groceries remained. To the investigators, it felt staged, as though a moment in time had been frozen and left behind. But if it was staged, by whom? And to what end? Neighbors in the area were questioned. Some claimed they hadn't noticed the vehicle until police found it. A few said they had driven past earlier that day and thought nothing of it, assuming it belonged to someone walking the trails nearby. But no one recalled seeing Mark himself. No one reported a man entering the woods. No one saw him leave the car. It was as if he had evaporated into the trees. Detectives considered possibilities. Could he have parked, wandered into the forest, and suffered a medical episode? Could he have been lured away? The location complicated things. The wooded lot wasn't remote, but it was quiet enough for someone to disappear without immediate notice. Officers combed the trails and ravines surrounding the pull-off. They found no clothing, no disturbed ground, no sign of a struggle. Search dogs were brought in once again. The animals circled the car, barked briefly, then followed a faint trail a few dozen yards into the woods before losing it entirely. It was an eerie echo of the first night, evidence that his scent had lingered, but not enough to explain what happened after. The unsettling detail was how ordinary the scene felt. The groceries hadn't spoiled yet. The car was clean, the doors secured. It didn't feel like the aftermath of violence, nor did it resemble an accident site. It felt paused, like a book with its pages left open mid-sentence. Detectives were reluctant to say it aloud, but privately, some admitted it looked as if the driver had simply stepped out and never returned. For his family, the discovery brought only torment. His wife clung to the idea that finding the car meant he was nearby, maybe injured, maybe waiting. She begged police to widen the search radius, to bring in more volunteers. Night after night, she imagined him lying in the woods, unable to call out, while the car sat untouched by the road. But each search came up empty. The only thing certain was that the vehicle wasn't moving, and Mark wasn't in it. Investigators examined the possibility of foul play. Could someone have intercepted him, forced him out, and locked the car behind them? But then why leave the groceries? Why take nothing? There were no fingerprints other than his own, no foreign DNA, no evidence of forced entry. The idea of a stranger orchestrating such a meticulous removal seemed implausible without leaving a trace. Yet the alternative, that he had walked off willingly, was equally hard to accept. The pull-off itself became a point of obsession. Officers returned repeatedly, walking the perimeter, probing the soil, studying maps of underground utilities and geological features. Some locals mentioned that the ground in that area had always been unstable, prone to sudden shifts. Others recalled hearing odd noises from the ravine after heavy rains. But these were anecdotes, nothing investigators could tie to the missing man. When detectives briefed his wife, she stared at the photos of the groceries in the back seat. She whispered that it didn't make sense. Mark would never leave food to spoil, never leave the car unlocked, never walk off without telling someone. She was right. It didn't make sense. That was the problem. By the end of that week, the official record noted only this: Mark Ellison's vehicle was recovered intact, abandoned, locked, with no sign of him nearby. It was a lead, but it explained nothing. If anything, it made the disappearance stranger. The man had left behind his car, his groceries, and every clue to his whereabouts. What he hadn't left behind was himself. The discovery of Mark Ellison's car shifted the search from streets and highways into the woods. The pull-off where it was found led to a web of trails cutting through uneven terrain, where thick undergrowth gave way to sudden drops and narrow ravines. Investigators knew that if Mark had left his car voluntarily, these woods were the most logical place he could have gone. And if he hadn't walked in on his own, then someone could have forced him there. Either way, the next step was clear. They would have to search the forest, inch by inch. On the second morning after his disappearance, volunteers from the community joined police units and fire crews in an organized grid search. They moved shoulder to shoulder, calling his name, marking trees with ribbons to avoid covering the same ground twice. At first, spirits were high. People believed that somewhere out there, Mark might be hurt but alive. Every shout, every rustle in the brush carried the hope of an answer. But as hours turned into days, that optimism began to drain. Cadaver dogs were deployed, brought in from neighboring counties. Handlers led them through the trails, across shallow creeks and down into the ravines. At one point, 2 dogs alerted faintly near a steep embankment, tails stiffening, noses pressed to the soil. Teams focused on that area, probing the ground, pulling back brush, and even lowering ropes into the narrow cut of the ravine. But whatever trace the dogs had picked up seemed to vanish as suddenly as it appeared. Their interest faded, and with it, the fragile hope that they had been close to something concrete. The terrain itself became a problem. Much of the land was unstable, filled with loose rock and patches of limestone. Searchers noted sections that seemed to hollow underfoot, giving the unsettling impression of empty space beneath. Some locals spoke quietly of sinkholes, recalling stories of sudden collapses after heavy rains. Old-timers mentioned hearing groans from the ground, deep echoes that carried through the ravines at night. To many in the town, it seemed possible, perhaps even likely, that the earth itself had swallowed him. Detectives, however, remained cautious. They couldn't rely on folklore. They flagged the area for geological review, but continued to press the theory of foul play. If Mark had been lured or forced from his car, the woods offered cover for an abductor. Yet there were no broken branches, no drag marks, no signs of a struggle. Forensic technicians found nothing, no fibers, no blood, not even a footprint that could be tied to him with certainty. The silence of the forest mirrored the silence of the case. For his family, the waiting was unbearable. His wife joined several searches, walking with volunteers, her face pale with exhaustion. At night, she would sit at the edge of the pull-off where his car had been found, staring into the dark trees. She said it felt like he was out there somewhere, just beyond reach, calling but unable to be heard. Neighbors brought food, but she barely touched it, her focus fixed on the woods. The children grew restless, asking questions no one could answer. Every time they looked toward the forest, they seemed to expect their father to walk out of it. Investigators struggled with the lack of direction. One detective described it later as chasing smoke. You could sense it, catch faint traces of it, but the second you tried to hold it, it disappeared. The faint alerts from the dogs lingered in everyone's mind. Was it possible he had been buried, hidden in a cavity below the soil? Was there something deeper in the ground that they couldn't see? They ordered a ground-penetrating radar survey in a small section near the ravine, but the results were inconclusive. The earth was irregular, full of voids and fractures, any of which could be natural or something more. Days passed and the search scaled back. Volunteers went home. The officers who had combed the same acres over and over admitted they had nothing new to follow. The official record noted the faint alerts and the geological instability, but without evidence, the theories remained just that, theories. A man couldn't simply vanish into the woods, and yet, Mark had. When detectives finally sat down with his wife to explain the status of the search, they avoided using the word hopeless, but the implication was clear. Leads were exhausted. Without new information, the case would stall. She sat silent, gripping the photo of him she had carried every day since he vanished. Hope hadn't left her, not yet. But across the table, the detectives carried a different weight. They weren't sure if Mark Ellison had walked into the woods at all, and if he had, they weren't sure he had walked in there alone. Weeks bled into months, and the urgency of the search shifted into a grinding investigation. When the woods gave no answers, detectives turned inward, into Mark Ellison's life. If he hadn't been taken by the ground or by someone else, then perhaps he had chosen to disappear. It wasn't a theory his wife wanted to hear, but investigators had to consider every possibility. They pulled his financial records, his phone history, his emails. On paper, his life looked painfully ordinary. No secret accounts, no large withdrawals, no evidence of planning. His credit cards hadn't been touched since the morning he vanished. The groceries still sitting in the back seat of his car stood as the last proof of his movements. Oh, but suspicion has a way of growing in silence. Some officers wondered aloud if perhaps the carefully parked car was deliberate, that Mark had locked it, left his purchases behind, and walked into the forest to start over somewhere new. Others leaned toward abduction, though they admitted the lack of evidence was troubling. There was no ransom note, no suspicious phone call, no reports of threats against him. The theories circled each other, both plausible and yet both riddled with holes. Detectives turned their focus to his marriage. His wife, once viewed purely as the grieving spouse, now sat across from investigators in long, tense interviews. They asked about arguments, about money, about whether she had suspected him of infidelity. She denied all of it. She admitted that, like any couple, they had disagreements, but nothing serious enough to push him to leave. Neighbors and friends described their relationship as stable, affectionate even. Still, the questioning left scars. She told her sister afterward that it felt like they were waiting for her to confess to something she hadn't done. Whispers spread through the community. Some believed Mark had been abducted, pulled into a vehicle by someone who knew the area well enough to vanish without notice. Others whispered darker theories, that he had grown tired of his responsibilities, that he had chosen to walk away from his family. In the absence of facts, rumor filled the space. The family could feel the shift when they went to the grocery store or sat in church. People stared too long, spoke in hushed tones, offered sympathy that carried an edge of doubt. Detectives continued probing his friendships and work relationships. His employer described him as reliable, trustworthy, the kind of man who never called in sick without good reason. Co-workers echoed the same. His friends were cooperative, shaken by his disappearance, but none of them had anything to hide. Investigators examined travel records, convinced he might have used his passport, but found nothing. His identity simply stopped on the day he went missing, like a tape cut off mid-recording. By late summer, the case file had thickened but offered no answers. The car remained the most haunting piece of evidence, a sealed capsule of an ordinary errand that ended in chaos. Forensic teams revisited it multiple times, testing for prints, fibers, and even re-examining the soil beneath where it had been parked. Nothing changed. It was still only his prints, still only his groceries, still only his absence. For his family, the passing months were cruel. His children grew restless, confused by the half-explanations given to them. His wife drifted between numbness and anger, demanding answers that no one could give. She felt trapped in a story with no ending, one where she was forced to relive the same day over and over. Every night she locked the doors, checked the driveway, and wondered if tomorrow would bring something new. But tomorrow always came empty. Detectives admitted privately that they had hit a wall. Theories about sinkholes and unstable ground remained speculative. The possibility of foul play seemed less likely with every clean sweep of evidence, and yet the idea of a voluntary disappearance never sat comfortably either. Mark Ellison had left behind his car, his wallet, his phone, his groceries, his family. Everything that defined him. People don't vanish without a trace, investigators reminded themselves, and yet here was a case where someone had. By the time autumn arrived, the search had officially scaled back. The file was still open, but the resources dwindled. Leads grew colder with every week. His family was left to live in the hollow space of uncertainty, clinging to fading hope while detectives carried the weight of unanswered questions. In town, the case lingered like a wound, something people lowered their voices to talk about, a story that reminded them how quickly normal could dissolve into nightmare. Years slipped by, and the silence around Mark Ellison's disappearance hardened into something heavier. His case remained technically open, But with no evidence, no witnesses, and no credible leads, it was little more than a file gathering dust. For his family, the waiting never stopped. Every knock at the door, every unexpected phone call carried the hope that perhaps this time there would be news. But there never was. The pull-off where his car had been found grew over with weeds, a quiet scar along the road that people passed without speaking about. Yet time has a way of uncovering what was buried, sometimes literally. Nearly a decade after Mark went missing, strange reports began circulating along the very stretch of road where he was last seen. Small sinkholes had started to appear, patches of earth collapsing suddenly, leaving gaping cavities in yards and along drainage ditches. At first, residents treated them as minor nuisances, but when a section of roadway caved in after heavy rain, it drew official attention. Geologists surveyed the area and confirmed what many locals already suspected. The ground itself was unstable. The town sat on a layer of limestone riddled with voids, prone to erosion. Water seeped through, carving unseen tunnels until the surface gave way. As word spread, people began to look back at Mark's case with new eyes. Old rumors resurfaced, stories of hollow ground, whispers that the earth in those woods had always been treacherous. Neighbors recalled how the cadaver dogs had alerted faintly near a ravine during the first searches, only to lose the scent. At the time it had been dismissed as inconclusive, but now it seemed ominous. Could it be that Mark hadn't been abducted or run away at all? Could he have been swallowed by the land beneath his car? The family seized on the theory, desperate for something tangible. For years they had been left without answers, and this offered at least the shadow of an explanation. His wife wrote letters to county officials, urging them to revisit the area with proper geological equipment. She reminded them that Mark's car had been found so close to where the ground was now giving way. It was impossible, she argued, that the two things weren't connected. Authorities listened politely, but hesitated to commit resources. The truth was that sinkholes, while unsettling, weren't uncommon in the region. And after so many years, investigators feared it would be impossible to link any geological event directly to Mark's disappearance. Still, whispers spread through town. Parents warned their children to stay off certain trails. Some avoided the ravine altogether, convinced that Mark's body lay beneath it, sealed in stone and soil all this time. For his family, the theory provided both hope and torment. It was comforting to imagine a natural explanation, that he hadn't abandoned them, that he hadn't been taken by another person. But it was agonizing too, because if the ground had swallowed him, then his remains were still there, just out of reach. His wife admitted privately that she often drove that stretch of road and stared at the trees, imagining him beneath them, calling but unable to be heard. Detectives, long since reassigned, remained cautious in their assessments. Some acknowledged that the sinkholes fit eerily well with the unanswered questions of the case. Others said it was just another layer of speculation, no stronger than the theories of abduction or voluntary disappearance. But the renewed attention stirred something in the community. For the first time in years, people were talking about Mark Ellison again, not as a man who had walked away, but as a man who might have been claimed by the land itself. The whispers grew louder, pressing authorities to at least reconsider the terrain as a factor. And though no one could yet prove it, the suspicion took hold. Perhaps the answer had never been in his past or in his relationships, but in the ground beneath his feet, waiting for the day it could no longer hold its silence. 10 years had passed since the morning Mark Ellison left for groceries and never returned. By then, his case had settled into that painful space between memory and myth, spoken about only in lowered voices or recalled briefly whenever another family's tragedy surfaced in the news. His wife still drove the same stretch of road where his car had been discovered, always slowing near the wooded pull-off, always watching the trees as though expecting them to give something back. She never stopped asking questions. And then, one summer afternoon, the ground itself answered in the most chilling way imaginable. It began with a storm. Heavy rains swept across the county for days, saturating the soil until drainage ditches overflowed and culverts collapsed. Residents awoke to find yards sunk several feet overnight, concrete driveways split down the middle. Near the same ravine where cadaver dogs had once alerted faintly, the ground gave way in a roar that neighbors later described as sounding like thunder trapped underground. By morning, a massive sinkhole had opened, swallowing a swath of earth nearly 30 feet across and plunging more than 60 feet down. Trees tilted inward, roots exposed like skeletal fingers, and at the bottom of the pit, sunlight glinted off something metallic. When authorities arrived, it was immediately clear this was more than a geological curiosity. From the rim, deputies could see jagged fragments of rusted steel half buried in the collapsed earth. The angle was steep, the walls unstable, and every step near the edge carried the risk of further collapse. The area was cordoned off as recovery teams were called in. Geologists confirmed what locals had always whispered: the land in this part of town sat on hollow limestone, riddled with voids that could collapse without warning. This sinkhole wasn't the first in the county, but it was by far the largest, and in its depths lay what looked disturbingly like the crushed remains of a vehicle. For detectives who had worked the Ellison case a decade earlier, the news hit like a jolt. The coordinates of the sinkhole lay barely 100 yards from where Mark's car had been found, parked in 2012. The proximity was too precise to ignore. When the first images of the wreckage reached them, many admitted privately that their stomachs dropped. After years of speculation, it seemed as though the earth itself was finally coughing up a secret it had swallowed. Recovery was dangerous. The sinkhole was unstable, its sides shedding loose rock and clumps of mud with every movement. Ropes were anchored to trucks, and technicians rappelled down, careful not to trigger further collapse. As they descended, the outline of the wreckage sharpened. Twisted steel beams, a section of bumper, the faint ghost of blue paint beneath a crust of rust. The vehicle had been crushed beneath tons of soil, compacted into a distorted shell. It was almost unrecognizable, except for the shape of the wheels and the fractured frame. But as one technician brushed away mud from a fragment of the grille, the embossed letters came into view, the same make and model as Mark Ellison's car. The news spread quickly. Word reached his family within hours, and his wife, trembling, drove to the site, where deputies held her back behind police tape. She stood on the shoulder of the road, staring into the pit where strangers were uncovering what she had feared and hoped for in equal measure. Reporters gathered, neighbors whispered, and once again, the town's attention turned toward the case that had haunted them for a decade. Piece by piece, the vehicle was uncovered. Investigators documented everything meticulously, photographing the position of the car, the way it had collapsed inward, the condition of the soil around it. It was determined that the car must have fallen into a cavity years earlier, its weight breaking through a thin crust of limestone and plunging into the void below. Over time, sediment and vegetation had sealed the surface again, erasing any sign of disturbance. For a decade, the car had been entombed beneath the forest floor, invisible to searchers walking above it. The sight of the wreckage raised as many questions as it answered. The vehicle was far too damaged to determine immediately if anyone had been inside when it fell. Forensic teams prepared to extract it piece by piece, a process that would take days. Each time workers removed soil from the cavity, more of the car emerged: bent doors, shattered glass, fragments of the trunk. The silence around the pit was heavy, every onlooker waiting for the moment when bones or belongings would confirm what everyone suspected. For detectives, it was surreal. For years they had combed those woods, flown helicopters overhead, brought in dogs and drones, and yet the truth had been hidden directly beneath them. The ravine where the dogs had alerted now seemed almost prophetic, a clue that had been dismissed too quickly. One investigator admitted to colleagues that it felt like the case itself had been waiting for the right moment to be revealed, as though the ground wasn't ready to give it up until now. By the end of the week, the car's crushed remains were finally secured and lifted from the pit. It was hoisted out on cables, swinging gently above the earth that had concealed it for so long. Mud clung to every surface, rust flaked off in sheets, but the license plate was still faintly legible beneath the grime. There was no doubt anymore. The car belonged to Mark Ellison. And with that confirmation, the question shifted from where he had gone to what had happened to him once the ground took him in. Once the crushed shell of the vehicle was lifted from the sinkhole and laid out under the floodlights of the recovery site, the truth of what it held began to emerge. Technicians in protective suits worked carefully, prying open what was left of the doors, peeling back panels distorted by years of pressure. At first, it was only mud and rust, but then, in the driver's side, footwell, bones appeared, fragile, brittle, and unmistakably human. For everyone present, the weight of the discovery was immediate. After 10 years, the mystery of Mark Ellison had a body. Inside the car, searchers found more than bones. Wedged between collapsed seats and matted upholstery were fragments of clothing, a leather wallet with cards still intact, and in the back seat, sealed in a bag that had hardened into brittle plastic, the original grocery receipt from that morning in 2012. The items felt like relics of an ordinary day frozen in time. Detectives held them in silence, aware that these were not just pieces of evidence, but the last tangible echoes of a life cut short. The skeletal remains were removed with precision, each fragment catalogued and bagged. Forensic anthropologists confirmed they were consistent with a male of Mark's age and build. Dental records later left no doubt it was him. To the public, it seemed the case had finally reached its end. Headlines announced that the missing man had been found, his fate explained by geology, his story closed by the earth itself. His family, after years of waiting, finally had something to bury. But as investigators examined the details, unease crept back in. The wreckage told a story, but it was not a simple one. The driver's seatbelt was unbuckled, lying slack across the console. One of the front doors, though mangled from the collapse, showed signs of having been ajar before the fall, as though it had not been fully closed. And the position of the remains raised questions. His bones were not pinned tightly in the driver's seat, but shifted toward the center, suggesting movement or that he had not been seated properly when the car dropped. Forensic teams considered possibilities. Could he have climbed partially out before the collapse, only to be pulled down with the vehicle? Could the violence of the fall have jarred the door loose and thrown his body? Both scenarios were plausible, but neither could be proven with certainty. To complicate matters further, no personal items typically carried on the body, a watch, keys, or his phone, were recovered with the remains. The wallet was found, but oddly, it was lodged under the back seat rather than in a pocket or near the bones. Theories began to split. Some investigators argued the inconsistencies could be explained by the sheer violence of the collapse. The ground might have given way suddenly, sending the car tumbling, jolting the door open and scattering belongings. Others were less convinced. They pointed out that the car had been locked when discovered years earlier, near the pull-off, with the groceries neatly in the back seat. How then had it ended up in the sinkhole, buried out of sight, with a body inside, but signs suggesting the driver hadn't been fully seated? The timeline seemed fractured, as though the car had lived two separate stories before meeting its end underground. For the family, the questions were agonizing. His wife, while grateful to finally have his remains, struggled to accept the details. She asked detectives again and again why the seatbelt wasn't buckled, why the door looked open, why his things were scattered. She admitted that part of her still feared someone else had been involved, that the collapse might have been a convenient grave rather than a tragic accident. Detectives, careful with their words, told her there was no definitive evidence of foul play, but there was also no way to rule it out entirely. The community, once eager for closure, found itself unsettled. At first, everyone had been ready to believe the simple story, that Mark Ellison had been swallowed by unstable ground, lost for a decade, and finally returned. But the inconsistencies refused to fade. People began to whisper again, this time about whether the sinkhole had truly taken him or whether someone had made sure it did. In the official record, the finding was clear. Mark Ellison's remains were recovered in his vehicle, both buried in a geological collapse. But unofficially, among investigators and neighbors alike, the discovery did not feel like an ending. It felt like the case had opened itself again, forcing everyone to look harder at what they thought they knew. The car in the earth had answered the question of where Mark Ellison went, but it had raised another, far darker question. What exactly had happened to him before the ground closed over his story? The recovery of Mark Ellison's remains should have closed the case, but instead it cracked it wide open again. In the weeks that followed, experts from multiple fields, geologists, forensic anthropologists, accident reconstructionists, were invited to review the evidence. What should have been straightforward quickly became murky, each specialist pulling the story in a different direction. The only certainty was that his car had ended up in a sinkhole, entombed for a decade. Everything else was up for debate. The most common explanation was the simplest, that Mark had driven unknowingly over a thin crust of limestone, and at that precise moment, the ground gave way. The car plunged into the void, burying him instantly. But the condition of the vehicle complicated this neat version. The seatbelt was unbuckled, the door was ajar. His wallet wasn't on him, but lodged under the back seat. These were details not easily explained by a sudden collapse. If he had been driving normally when the sinkhole opened, investigators reasoned, the belt should have been fastened, the door closed, his belongings still on him. The inconsistencies gnawed at them. Some specialists suggested an alternative sequence. Perhaps the sinkhole had existed, hidden but partially open, before the collapse that finally sealed it. They theorized Mark may have parked near the ravine, stepped out to investigate, and in doing so triggered the final collapse, which swallowed the vehicle but left him precariously close to the edge. In that scenario, he might have been outside the car when it plunged, only to be dragged down moments later. It was a chilling image, a man watching his own car vanish into the earth, then slipping into the same void himself. But if that were the case, why had no one ever found footprints, drag marks, or any evidence on the surface? The initial searchers had found nothing but silence. Others raised even darker possibilities. Could someone have used the unstable terrain to their advantage? A staged disappearance? A body placed in the vehicle after death, the collapse serving as a perfect grave? The suggestion bordered on conspiracy, but detectives admitted privately it couldn't be dismissed outright. The car had been found locked and undisturbed at the pull-off in 2012. How then had it traveled from that location into the hidden cavity, later revealed by the sinkhole? Was it possible that the car recovered years later wasn't abandoned voluntarily, but moved there deliberately before being swallowed by the land? The logistics were daunting, but the idea persisted. Mark's family was caught in the crossfire of these theories. His wife attended every briefing, listening as experts dissected the possibilities like surgeons over a body. One day she was told it was an accident, a tragic act of geology. The next, she heard whispers of foul play, of staging, of someone ensuring he would never return. She confessed later that it felt like reliving his disappearance all over again, hope rising with one explanation, despair with the next. All she wanted was a truth she could hold, something solid after years of uncertainty. But even in death, Mark was slipping through her fingers. Investigators revisited the early days of the case, searching for connections they might have missed. They re-examined interviews, rechecked timelines, and studied the original location of the car. The memory of the cadaver dogs faintly alerting near the ravine now carried an eerie weight, as though the animals had sensed something beneath the surface long before humans could prove it. If the sinkhole had been there all along, concealed but waiting, had they walked over his grave without realizing? Or had someone used that natural weakness in the land to erase him with terrifying precision? In town, the speculation was relentless. Some insisted it had to be an accident. No one could engineer a collapse like that, they said. No one could plan for the earth itself to cooperate. Others weren't so sure. They pointed out the odd placement of his belongings, the fact that the seatbelt wasn't fastened. One neighbor told reporters it looked more like a staged scene than an accident, though he admitted he had no proof. The sinkhole became more than a geological feature. It became a mirror, reflecting whatever fear or suspicion people already carried. For the detectives who had lived with the case for a decade, the contradictions were maddening. They wanted closure as much as the family, but the evidence refused to align neatly. It was like trying to reconstruct a puzzle with pieces missing, and every theory seemed to leave a corner unaccounted for. Did Mark accidentally drive into an undetected collapse? Was he outside the car when it fell? Or had someone used the terrain as a silent accomplice? The answers shifted with every examination, leaving only shadows. By the end of the inquiry, the official report leaned toward accident. The language was careful, acknowledging geological instability as the likely cause of death. But within the margins of the report were unanswered questions, noted quietly but never resolved. Even with a body, even with a vehicle, even with a decade of hindsight, no one could say with certainty how Mark Ellison had spent his final moments. The sinkhole had given him back, but not the truth. And as his family prepared to lay him to rest, they carried not only grief but a lingering dread that someone or something knew more about those lost minutes than the earth was willing to reveal. The conclusion came not with certainty, but with resignation. After months of examination, the case of Mark Ellison was officially declared solved. The final report from county authorities stated he had died in a geological accident, his vehicle swallowed by unstable ground and concealed until the sinkhole exposed it years later. It was written in neat, measured language, the kind that avoided speculation and closed the file. To outsiders, it read like resolution. To those who knew the details, it felt like a verdict carved from shadows. His family held a funeral that autumn. For the first time in 10 years, there was something tangible to lay to rest. The casket was small, filled only with skeletal fragments and a few personal items recovered from the wreck. His wife placed the faded grocery receipt inside before the lid closed, a final reminder of how ordinary the day had been before it turned into tragedy. The service drew neighbors, co-workers, and old friends, many of whom hadn't seen each other since the early days of the search. They spoke of closure, of finally being able to grieve properly. But beneath the hymns and condolences lingered something unsettled. The questions hadn't gone away. They had only been buried along with him. The inconsistencies remained like splinters. Why was his seatbelt unbuckled? Why was the door ajar? How had his wallet been found beneath the back seat rather than on his body? These weren't details that could be erased with the stroke of a pen on an official report. Detectives admitted privately that they had never seen a case quite like it, one where the evidence pointed in multiple directions at once, refusing to settle on a single truth. For some, the simplest explanation was still the most believable. A tragic accident, a man in the wrong place at the wrong time, claimed by the earth without warning. For others, that simplicity felt dishonest, a way of avoiding the darker possibilities. Rumors spread through the town like a second funeral procession. Some whispered that Mark had been alive when the car went down, that perhaps he had been trying to escape, unbuckled and half out the door before the collapse took him. Others wondered aloud whether someone had used the unstable ground as the perfect hiding place, steering suspicion away by letting nature cover the crime. One neighbor told a reporter that the earth itself seemed complicit, swallowing the evidence for a decade before releasing only fragments, never the full story. In diners and church halls, the question echoed, was Mark Ellison a victim of geology or of something far more human? His wife lived with both possibilities pressing on her. She told friends that she still woke at night imagining the moment the ground gave way. Did he scream? Did he fight to climb out? Was he already unconscious, or did he watch as the earth closed over him? And worse still, had someone else been there, ensuring he never returned home? These thoughts ate at her long after the funeral ended, long after the flowers had wilted. Closure, people said, but she never felt it. She only felt the hollow truth that even with a body, the mystery remained. For the investigators who had spent years circling the case, the end brought no triumph. They knew the file would sit marked solved, but to them, it was a fragile solution held together by absence rather than evidence. One retired detective admitted in an interview that he thought about Mark Ellison every time he drove that stretch of road. He said the earth had given something back, yes, but never enough. The truth, he believed, was still buried somewhere deeper, beyond reach. Over time, the case faded from headlines, replaced by newer tragedies, fresher mysteries. But for the town, the story of Mark Ellison remained a cautionary tale, a reminder of how quickly the ordinary could dissolve into the unexplainable. Parents warned children about the ravine, neighbors slowed their cars near the sinkhole, and even years later, people avoided walking too close to the edge. The earth had a memory, they said. It could take and it could give, but it never returned everything. In the end, what the sinkhole revealed was only part of the story. It gave back a car, a body, and a receipt from an ordinary grocery run. It confirmed that Mark Ellison hadn't vanished into thin air, hadn't staged an escape to another life. But it also left behind chilling gaps, evidence that didn't add up, questions that couldn't be silenced. Was he alive when the car went down? Did someone else ensure he never returned? The answers remained sealed, leaving his family and his town with only fragments of truth. The earth had hidden him for 10 years, and when it finally spoke, it spoke in half-truths, in whispers, in shadows. What it revealed was enough to close the file, but never enough to close the wound.